everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on approaching religion and donation with cultural humility. My name is Deanna Fenton, Program Manager here at the Alliance, and it's my pleasure to introduce today's program. Now, before we go ahead and get started, I'd just like to quickly review a few of our upcoming webinars. For those of you who may be interested in joining us in the future, please note that registration is currently open for our next transplant-focused webinar, where we'll discuss double lung transplantation as a result of post-COVID fibrosis. Be sure to join us for that on November 19th at 3 p.m. Eastern. Registration is also open for our innovation webinar entitled Planes, Drones, and Automobiles: How Unmanned Aircraft May Be a Solution to the Organ Transplant Challenges of COVID-19. You can put that on your calendars for December 3rd at 2 p.m. Eastern. Now, as always, to keep up to date on all the latest information pertaining to our webinars, please visit our website at organdonationalliance.org. For those of you who may be interested in continuing education credits, please note we are offering 1 CEPC credit and 1 nursing contact hour as a result of your participation today. For those of you seeking CEs that may not be offered, a certificate of attendance is also available for you to claim. Prior to receiving your certificates or credits, you'll be asked to complete a brief online evaluation, which will allow you the opportunity to provide us with your valuable feedback. As a friendly reminder, you'll have 30 calendar days to claim your credits and certificates. Now, without further ado, I'd like to go ahead and begin today's program by introducing our moderator, Amanda Habermill, Manager of Hospital Development at Connect Life. Amanda, thank you so much for joining us. And at this point, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Thank you, Deanna. It is my pleasure to introduce today's presenters. Our first speaker is Susan Cochran. She is the aftercare specialist and interfaith outreach at Gift of Hope. Susan has worked for Gift of Hope for 17 years, requesting for donation in hospitals for 11 years, and is now an aftercare specialist for donor families. Susan also manages an Interfaith Council for Gift of Hope, comprised of many faith leaders representing multiple world religions. The council advises at Gift of Hope on interfaith issues, including donation, authorization, outreach, and aftercare. Susan began her career as a broadcast journalist. She then went to seminary, received a master's in religion, and functioned as a full-time ordained minister for 5 years before joining Gift of Hope in 2003. Our second speaker is Brian Carwana. Brian is the executive director at Encounter World Religion Center. Brian is known as the Religions Geek. He serves as the executive director of Encounter World Religions based out of Toronto and has spent 20 years teaching on religious diversity and religious literacy. In addition, he has a master's in religion and culture and a PhD from the University of Toronto in religion and politics. He has consulted on religion and donation to OPOs in the United States, including Gift of Hope, Live on New York, and the New Jersey Sharing Network. You can follow Brian at Twitter at Religions Geek. Now, without further ado, we'll turn it over to Brian and Susan.
Yes, good morning and good afternoon, wherever you are. We appreciate you joining us here. We do want to make note that Brian and I did receive some assistance from Jennifer Aguilar at Gift of Hope. Again, my name is Susan Cochran. I'm with the OPO in Chicago called Gift of Hope. We serve the greater Chicago area as well as most of Illinois and Northwest Indiana. My primary role at Gift of Hope is as an aftercare specialist, and many of you know that that's serving the needs of donor families post-donation. I started my career as a requester for 11 years. I did that at first. But right now in donor aftercare, you can see these are a couple of family meetings. The one on the right, a donor mom listening to the lungs of her son and a recipient, and then 2 families coming together, 2 kidney recipients and the donor family. And those are really beautiful things. I feel an honor to be part of that. Another hat that I wear is I facilitate Gift of Hope's Interfaith Council, a council that was put together 6 years ago. Jennifer is on the far right. She assists me with that. We have representation from Judaism, Catholicism, Buddhism, Baha'i, Sikhism, as well as Hinduism and Islam and several Christian religions. The greater part of who I am is my family. This is my son, Dane, and my daughter, Faith. They're on the left. And If you think love can't happen to you when you're 62 years old, you're wrong. I'm celebrating my 3-month anniversary. I got married 3 months ago via Zoom, but it still counts. Without further ado, I want to introduce Brian Carwana. I met Brian when I was with the Encounter World Religions group, and I went up there and thought it was such a great deal that I invited him to come back to Gift of Hope, and he provided staff training for us. Very valuable experience, and Brian and I have been friends and colleagues since then. So for now, I'm going to turn it over to you, Brian.
Thanks, Susan. Yeah, and thank you everyone for being here. We really appreciate having you here to talk about this important topic. Yeah, my name is Brian Carwana, and I go by the moniker Religions Geek. You can find me at religionsgeek.com, where I blog about all things to do with religion and politics and religion and work. And I've been studying religion for 20 years. As mentioned, I've recently completed my PhD, but most of my work actually has been as the executive director of Encounter World Religions. It's called Encounter because although I don't really teach about religions in some respects, what I teach about is people. Religions are made up of people and communities. And so I teach people classes, but where possible, I also try to take them to places of worship where we tour around, we meet community leaders and sometimes observe ritual. And I've been doing this for the public for a long time. But over in the last number of years, people like Susan who've come to my programs have said, Brian, we need this at our place of work. And so, for example, right now I'm doing monthly presentations at one of the largest police forces in Canada. I go in every month and talk about a different religion, because if you're police, you need to know about the people that you're serving. I've been invited to speak to municipal staff as well. I've been on a number of panels, and this has included the healthcare field, where I've done things in the OPO field. In particular, I've done 4-day in-person programs. This was, the pre-COVID era, where we got on those things that they call planes. And I did 4-day programs. I did 2 at Gift of Hope. We had kind of a repeat, so I went there a second time, but also to Live on New York and to the New Jersey Sharing Network. So that's enough about me. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Susan.
All right, thank you, Brian. And we really did enjoy having Brian with us. I want to go over some of the objectives for today's meeting. Brian and I want to talk about the value of cultural competency as it relates primarily to religion, and becoming aware of the importance and complexity of religious literacy. And that might be a new phrase to you. Brian's going to fully express that. And then we're going to describe the value of cultural humility as it relates to interacting with donor families, recipients, hospital and OPO partners. And then, of course, we're going to identify best practices. And Deanna, I think there we go, to advance the slide. Thank you. Culture is a term that we've all heard of, but sometimes we think of it as one thing. We think of it as maybe what we can see, color of someone's skin, their ethnicity. But culture is meaning almost everything about a person: age, gender, sexual orientation, disability, et cetera, et cetera. But for today, we're talking about religion. Other areas of a person will definitely overlap with that. What is cultural competence? Well, that is a term that is used a lot, but it doesn't have a singular definition that I've been able to find. Different companies put out what they think cultural competence is. Early in the 90s, the term really had some unrealistic expectations. When it talked about cultural competence, it was an expectation that you were an expert in the field, that you knew everything about it. I was digging around and I found that this definition from the American Medical Association was really the best for us today. The knowledge and interpersonal skills that allow providers to understand, appreciate, and work with individuals from cultures other than their own, which is what we all do in this field. Look at the words that are boldened. We're going to talk about those today. Involves awareness, self-awareness, knowledge of a patient's culture, and adaptation of skills. So I guess the question of the day, maybe oversimplified, is why is it important to even understand culture and religion regarding organ, tissue, and research donation? Well, quite frankly, it helps us better support our diverse families. If you live in Chicago like I do, you are living in a very religiously diverse area. Most urban areas are. But the interesting thing is that our rural areas and our more suburban areas are becoming more religiously diverse also. So when helping a family on the OPO side, it's very important for us to understand these things so we can help to have more sensitive conversations about donation. And we want to be able to do that to support the family. We want to be able to use the language that's important to them. When you're an OPO and you're going to see a patient, by the very nature of it, you're in the death and dying arena. And when a family's traumatized and talking about the death of a loved one, or perhaps that loved one's already been declared brain dead, or a family is trying to decide whether to withdraw support, then they oftentimes rely on their faith. Even if they have not been to church or synagogue or mosque or whatever in 30 years, they oftentimes go back to the faith, maybe the faith that they were raised in. Also on the transplant side, for any transplant coordinators that we have, you know how stressful it is for a patient to be waiting for an organ. That's life and death sometimes, and healing from an organ transplant. Also, understanding religion and donation, it helps us support our partners. If I go into a hospital and the attending physician is of another religion, if I know a little bit about that, then I can be supportive, I can have conversations. And also one of the things it does is really helps us minimize some of our unintended consequences that could come about through inadvertently using the wrong words and language. Cultural competence is a journey, and we just don't get there by taking a few courses. So how do we begin is the question of the day. And so we decided to put together a little imagery for you. The vehicle that you might use on this journey is a term, cultural humility. Now, many of you may not have heard this term before. It actually begins in the social work field, but it's almost exactly as it sounds. We all know what humility is. And this is just being very humble about what we know and what we don't know, and also being very self-aware about what our own journey is. Even if you're an expert on religion like Brian is, you're not going to know everything there is to know when you walk into a room and you're meeting with a patient or a patient's family. Maybe the referral's been called in. This is a Catholic family. Okay, well, we know that Catholicism as a religion supports organ and tissue donation. So can we just anticipate that we're going to go in there and get a yes? No, it's not that easy. You have to be culturally humble. You don't know what aspects provide this family information so they can develop their own personal theology. Cultural humility, we find, is a lifelong process of self-reflection and self-critique. So that's the journey we're on. We all love self-awareness, right? And because we all love an acronym, we decided that we were going to be in the cultural humility car. And as you can see, you would have to be pretty humble to be in this particular little vehicle. And also a nod to our people on the East Coast, because they actually pronounce car the way this is spelled. So we're going to start with C for challenge, A for add, and ask and remember. And we're going to go down. We've chosen action words to help us get down this cultural humility and competence journey. The first term we're going to use is challenge. And what we're talking about here is something that maybe you've heard of a lot in the news lately, and that's implicit bias or unconscious bias. The American Medical Association definition of cultural competence calls for self-awareness. And so we're going to start with that self-critique, and it's finding out about implicit bias and bias. So where do we start? We start with an examination of our own beliefs and our own cultural identities. Strangely enough, some of us haven't spent much time with that. Our first challenge is identifying those beliefs and becoming self-aware. And You probably have heard the term unconscious or implicit bias, and that's the process of associating stereotypes or attitudes towards categories of people without our conscious awareness. So for today's talk, think about what your own biases might be. You might even think about what someone might be thinking about, what they are biased about, your own particular religion. The predominant religion in the United States is Christianity. There's 65% of people that have identified as Christian, and that number shifts all the time. So even if you don't happen to be a Christian, you're pretty familiar with that. Some of the other religions we don't know as much about. And so Brian's going to be hitting on that a little bit. But who are these people that have implicit bias? Are they bad people? Who are they? Well, we find out that we are all of those people. All of us have unconscious bias. Every one of us has unconscious bias. We'd all like to think that we're not biased, but we are. And before we think too poorly of ourselves, we need to remember that what our brain is doing is very important. This is a science thing. It's not a moral or an ethical issue. Unconscious bias is scientific brain activity. It is performing a vital function for us. Sometimes it's a little bit easier if we take it out of a personal realm. So I always like this picture of what bias and unconscious bias is. These animals may be walking down the street towards you perfectly calm, but you may have a reaction to one and a different reaction to the other just because of information that you have received throughout your life. Bias is the process that helps us wade through the millions of bits of information that come into our brain. We need that. Our brain couldn't handle it if we had to process everything. According to Project Implicit, which is a Harvard study, the brain uses these mental associations that are so well established that they operate without our awareness, without our intention, and without our control. And based on that information that we've received through the years, the brain tells us what to interpret as safe, what to interpret as dangerous, who to let in our tribe, who to keep out, those kind of things. But there is one problem with the brain function with unconscious bias. The problem is that these biases are only a guideline, and they're not always right. In fact, Daniel Kahneman, who's written extensively about bias, famously called the unconscious mind a machine for jumping to conclusions. So how does implicit bias show up? Well, when you're out walking your dog and you're in the hospital and you're working with people, it often shows up in our reactions to the good folk that we interact with. Generally, implicit bias shows up in spontaneous behaviors, which are often nonverbal, body language, social distancing. That meant something even pre-COVID, and making assumptions. We had one hospital staff refuse to refer a patient because they had some unconscious beliefs that Orthodox Jews did not donate. They did not allow us to approach this patient and the family. We have no idea whether this family would have donated or not, but Brian's going to share a little bit more about that particular group. Just a personal story here, because I want you to know everybody has unconscious bias. I feel like I'm very open religiously and have been for a very long time. But a personal story that I have, there was a time when I was a requester and I was waiting to go in and talk to a family, and I saw a neurologist that was actually rounding. And she was a neurologist that was dressed in the Muslim garb called a niqab from head to toe with just the eye opening. Well, my reaction to that was I kind of withdrew. I had a little bit of fear around it. I kind of had a little suspicion that maybe they didn't treat women well. And anyway, years later, I had an opportunity to interact with a young Muslim girl and her mom that came to speak at Gift of Hope. And I was able to dispel some of those because I added information to what some of my biases were. And Fatima was the little girl's name, and her mom was just delightful and hilarious. And I really thought a lot about her and learned a lot from that. So that's how implicit bias shows up. And that's a little bit about how we react to that. We have to acknowledge the biases. That allows us to exercise cultural humility. And Brian's going to talk to us about one of the other things we can do to kind of eliminate the implicit bias, and that's by adding some information.
Okay, thanks, Susan. Yeah, so in our CAR acronym, this is the first A, the second letter, and that is add. And it is to, add cultural competency. And cultural competency actually has sort of numerous streams to it. The one we're going to be talking about today is religious literacy. I realize religious literacy may be a term that might not be familiar for you. Religious literacy, to be clear, is not about promoting any religion or religion generally. I don't promote religion, I just educate people about it. And lots of people come to my programs are atheists, but just want to be religiously literate. And so that's what religious literacy is. That it is basic, what it sounds like. It's just having some basic knowledge to be able to recognize religious identity, and to know enough to not, without that, we can step on someone's toes, right? We can offend. And at other times, we're afraid of offending. And so we avoid the topic. There's this quick changing of the topic that keeps communicating to the person that there's something about them that cannot be addressed, right? That must be kind of kept hidden at some level. And that unwittingly, conveys something to the person about how welcome they are, how inclusive the situation is. Right. So religious literacy is just immensely, I think, important, mainly because of what I said earlier, which is that what it does is it values people. Right. I mentioned earlier, I'm not really teaching belief systems. You're teaching about people. This man is a prominent Canadian politician. He heads one of our three major parties. I know in the States you have two. We have three main parties, and he heads one of them. And religious literacy tells you a few things. It would tell you, first of all, that this man is Sikh. If you see someone in North America with a turban and a beard that hasn't been cut, that man is Sikh. Religious literacy would also tell you that while we say Sikh, they refer to themselves as the Sikhs. And if you had, if you knew that, if you knew to say to someone like this, oh, hi, are you a Sikh? I assure you that for them, that is an eye-widening moment. They're not used to people knowing that. It makes them feel seen. You will have their attention. My family comes from a small island in the Mediterranean called Malta. And, most people don't know what that is, or they vaguely heard of it. But every once in a while, I run into someone who, looking at my last name, sort of guesses that I'm Maltese. And it really catches you. Like you automatically feel a kind of bond to this person, right? Religious literacy does that. It would also teach us, third, that this man has not cut his beard since he was perhaps a teenager. And if for any reason, like sometimes in medical situations, we do have to shave, part of the face or something. And knowing that that will be a big deal to that person, because otherwise they feel like, oh, you're not going to understand. And them and their family are kind of commiserating. They don't know what to say. They're going to think I'm weird. But if you know that, and you can say at the beginning, hey, I know this is an issue for you, that's just very different, right? And that's what religious literacy does. It fosters trust. It fosters immense trust. Whether I'm speaking to OPOs or to police officers or educators or whoever, what I really emphasize is that religious literacy is just immensely valuable in so many ways. It helps you to understand your work colleagues. It helps you understand your neighbors, your daughters, boyfriends, family, and of course, patients and potential donor families. Religious literacy is not going to give you ironclad answers. We're going to talk about that because in truth, religions are diverse, so there's no single answer. But you are going to find that it is going to facilitate conversations of an entirely different nature. It helps you to be able to connect to that person, have a richer, more meaningful conversation. There is a lot of research that shows that people make decisions rarely on the basis of reasons and mostly on the basis of emotions. This is a general truth in these decisions where there is so much emotionally going on. Opening the door of trust, opening a good conversation is just going to be critical and might help save a life. Okay, so for religious literacy, what can we say about it? There are 4 principles identified by the Harvard Religious Literacy Project. they are first, and I've emphasized this point, that it is non-devotional. It's not about converting, it's just education about religion. Secondly, it is the recognition that religions are internally diverse. You know, if you speak to someone or you speak to four people, you know, there's a saying in Judaism that, you know, if there's four people in the room, there's five opinions. And in the same way, there's, you know, over 1.5 billion Muslims. And so even if you've had a number of Muslim families and you think you know what they think, I assure you, you don't know what 1.6 billion people think, right? Religions are internally diverse. Everyone's got their own story. You don't know that this person's, you know, brother was saved by an organ donor or something, right? So religions are internally diverse. Third, they evolve and change over time. This means, for example, that sometimes younger folks have different views than older folks, although not all older folks or all younger folks, of course, think the same. And last, religions are embedded in cultures. Sometimes dealing with a Buddhist, it might depend whether they're Japanese or whether they're Sri Lankan or whether they're a kind of Western Buddhist. So all of that matters. And we are going to talk in particular about this one, this internal diversity, because it ties to the cultural humility that Susan was talking about, that we need to be humble and not make presumptions just because we know that person belongs to this religion. We don't want to put them in a box and think we know, oh, this is what people in that religion always think, because it's not like that. I always, one example of this is I have a friend who is a Muslim in Toronto. He's a prominent guy. He's an immigration lawyer. He's gay, and he started up an LGBTQ mosque. In fact, he's so prominent that a number of other LGBTQ mosques have started up in other cities. And he's a devout Muslim. He knows Islam very well. He's clearly taken some schooling at university. Very knowledgeable guy, right? And so sometimes people think, oh, Muslims, you know, not, and they have this view of what the view will be on being gay, but religions are diverse. Everyone's got their story, whether it's on their views on gays or their views on organ donation. Okay, so let's take these principles and let's try and apply them. And so what I thought we'd do is a couple of case studies. So first, the case study of Islam. So first of all, in Islam, there is no pope. There is no, to use a Catholic analogy, there's no one person who sort of determines doctrine. So instead, people turn to their individual jurists and imams. They may ask the imam, their local imam, what they think. And so this really contributes to the kind of internal diversity we were talking about. We do know that there are a number of obstacles that frequently come up for Muslims. These include that there is a prohibition against mutilating the body. So of course you can see how organ donation for some sort of might be seen to violate that. Some believe that God sort of owns your body, and at the end of your life it is to go back to God and is not yours to kind of parcel out. Third, this is a big one. There is an understanding in Islam that God chooses the time and place of your birth and the time and place of your death. And so some fear that in organ donation that maybe you're interfering with God's plans for the recipient, and that can be an issue. And last, sometimes some people believe that the donor may be held sort of ethically or morally responsible for the recipient's actions, and that may make them hesitant. That said, there are also some real assets in Islam. The most important source of authority in Islam is the Quran, and the Quran says that to save a life is as if one has saved all of humanity. And this is important because there is a legal principle in Islam. It's part of the Sharia, the legal code, that says that extreme need overrides prohibitions. So you're not supposed to drink alcohol, you're not supposed to eat pork, but if it's the only food that you have, you are allowed to do both those things. You're supposed to pray 5 times a day, but if you're a surgeon, you are forbidden from stopping the surgery in Islam and praying, right? Extreme need sort of overrides prohibitions. And that means you can override those issues we were talking about potentially. It's also good to know that in Islam, organ donation is supported by some of the most influential bodies. There's no pope, but there's some bodies that have some sort of cachet. And so this includes the Oxford University of Islam, Al-Azhar University, which is almost 1,000 years old, the Grand Ulema Council of Saudi Arabia, the Iranian Religious Authority, and notice in green that some of these authorities are in the Sunni world and some in the Shia world, and as well the largest American body. So it's a lot of major bodies saying, you know, that this is okay. Who accepts? We do know that Arab Muslims on average are more accepting than those from India and Pakistan, and that this is true not only in those countries, but is also true for American immigrants who hail from there. And that reminds us that religions are culturally embedded, right? That culture matters. And again, it reminds us about the internal diversity. And we know that acceptance in the USA, there's some studies that show that the biggest factor is theology. And it's that matter I mentioned to you earlier, is illness perceived as a suffering imposed by God? Because if so, that can kind of be a real obstacle. Okay, so what are the takeaways from this case study? Do we know what every Muslim thinks about donation? No, of course we're not. Well, you're never going to know what every Muslim thinks about anything, right? And this is something we need to remind ourselves as a culture of humility. But we do know some things. We know that Muslims have a variety of views and that many will turn to their imam, their local imam, to get some ideas. We know they may have specific theological obstacles, and it can be helpful to know in advance that they may have concerns about mutilating a body or the idea that God owns the body. They may fear the donor being responsible for the recipient's actions, or they may see the other person's illness as kind of decided by God and something they shouldn't interfere with. However, we also know that there are assets. We know that the Quran compares saving a life to saving the world. And we know that there are key influential bodies, both here and abroad, that support it. All of that does not mean, of course, now, as we say, that we have the answer. But it does allow us to make that person feel like someone has taken some time to understand them. It'll make them feel seen. And that opens doors for a conversation where there's a lot more trust. And again, a lot of these decisions are so affected by emotion. So making the person feel seen is obviously really important. Okay, so let's go to our second case study, and this is Judaism. Judaism and Islam are two of the most similar religions, so you're going to see some overlap. First and foremost is that they have almost the exact same phrase, that whoever destroys a soul, it's considered as if he destroyed an entire world, and whoever saves a life, it's as if he had saved an entire world. And in Judaism, this means donation is not only allowed, but many Jews actually understand it as what is called a mitzvah, that is a commandment. So you must be willing to donate your organs. It's a commandment because you can save a life. There are obstacles, and there's kind of two types. There's secondary obstacles and then a main one. Some of the secondary obstacles are familiar. Again, there are rules against mutilating a body. There's a desire to bury quickly, which donation can sort of hamper. And there is this idea that one should not benefit from the dead, from a dead person. So those are kind of secondary obstacles. That said, similar to in Islam, saving a life is supposed to, according to Jewish law, to sort of override most objections. And so it would overcome these. However, if the person is, this is if there's a direct life being saved. And as a result, for some Jews, this can hamper donation for medical research or for tissue, where it's not like directly going to this person and going to save them. The main obstacle, however, some of you may know this, is about defining death and whether to accept brain death. I'm going to use the terminology from the tradition rather than OPO terminology here, because they also talk about two types of death, but the language they use is breathing death and heart death. There's an ancient Jewish authority, how do you determine death? And the answer was that you can either check the nostrils or the heart. And so some have paid attention to the breathing and some have paid attention to the heart. If they accept the cessation of breathing as being death, then they will accept brain death, because if the person's brain dead, there's a ventilator, there's a machine causing them to breathe, okay, then they're dead. But if they accept heart death, because I know the machine, of course, by keeping the breathing alive is keeping the heart going, but because the heart is not being mechanically kept going, because it is going somewhat on its own, then for those folks, they don't see brain death as valid. And that means the idea of saving a life will not override this, because you would be ending a life. It would be at some level murder. This view is particularly more prominent amongst Orthodox Jews, as some of you will know. But you don't want to make the assumption that all Orthodox Jews feel this way. Even if you've had 4 or 5 cases in the past, you don't know what the next person will think. Some Orthodox Jews do favor donation. Some not only favor donation, some actually advocate for it. This is a website set up by an Orthodox Jewish group advocating for organ donation. They've created videos, get your organ donor card, they have brochures, and it says here, make your last mitzvah, that is your last commandment, the most important one, right? So again, just to reemphasize this point, we want to remember that traditions are internally diverse. We don't want to make assumptions. We want to maintain cultural humility and not make assumptions. And so what's the take here then? Do we know what all Jews or all Orthodox Jews think about donation? I'm sure at this point, you know, the answer to that, of course, is that we don't. We do know some things. We know that Jews have a variety of views. We know there are several religious objections, but that most of them are overruled by the idea of saving a life. We do know, however, there's a big obstacle about whether brain death is a legitimate death, and that can quash everything else, essentially. And we know that denominations matter. Orthodox Jews are more often opposed, but again, some do support and some even advocate for it. And again, this is what religious literacy does, right? It gives you the grounds to go in more knowledgeably. That knowledge will bring comfort. They'll see that you know something about them. That will make them more comfort and felt seen. And all of that, I think, leads to the basis for better conversation and hopefully a potential to make a real difference. Okay, and now I'm going to turn it back over to Susan.
All right, thank you, Brian. So on the screen here, you'll see a little girl, a very cute little girl. Her name is Sadira Budatoki, and I'm sitting with her at Christmas. This is my little niece, and she's my great niece. And her mom is over on the right. That's Karen, and she is a woman that was raised in Iowa as a Christian. Her husband is Shobhakar Budatoki, and he is a Hindu man, and he was raised in Nepal. So what happens when we have little Sadira? Maybe she's waiting for an organ. Maybe she's, God forbid, you know, a potential organ donor. So how do we talk to this family? What is the difference here? And how do we navigate this? Not only is Karen just a member of a Christian, but she's in even a smaller denomination than that. So how do we go about that? We're pretty familiar, as I mentioned, with Christian theology, but what do we do with a mixed family? I'm going to ask Deanna to change the slide for me there. Great. Okay. So the third letter in our acronym of CAR is ASK. The situations can be very complex. That's part of cultural humility. Ask the question and then listen. Chaplains, you are great partners in helping ask these questions. Again, situations and circumstances can quite often be very complex, but the questions don't need to be. Just very respectfully ask, and then you have to listen. I started my career as a broadcast journalist, and you could always tell when there were young reporters, myself included, would have a list of questions that they were going to ask in an interview, and invariably they got so nervous that they'd ask a question, the person would answer that and the next question, but then they would ask the second question even though it had been answered. So in addition to asking, you also have to listen to what the answers are. The family will guide you in how best to support. So when an OPO representative approaches a family for an authorization conversation, they're not just usually dealing with an individual, they're dealing with an individual that's part of a cultural group. And so all of these things overlap and they can affect each other. Karen and Shobhakar and little Sadie are part of an interfaith family. And according to Pew Research, and it's the Pew Research, most of you are familiar with that, but they do a religious study every 10 years. The last one they did in 2014. And then they followed up with a survey in 2015. And what they discovered is that fully 1/4 of young adults or millennials are raised in multicultural families. So when you go into a family, you may not just be going into a Catholic family or a Muslim family or a Hindu family. There may be a great mix. We had a situation where a hospital referred a Muslim patient to us, and they requested that we send a male requester because they saw all of the men, and they just made the assumption through their own maybe unconscious bias that they wouldn't talk to a woman. It turned out in that particular situation, we said whoever is up next, and that happened to be a female requester, but the wife happened to be Christian, and the male members of the family didn't try to block anything. They were very accepting, and so it was very nice, and it was just not at all what the hospital thought it was. So again, ask the questions and we'll get the answers. The last letter is to remember, and maybe this isn't something that has seemed really important. You hear the word compassion a lot, and perhaps you don't evaluate exactly how important it is. But I think the most powerful energy that we have when we're dealing with any kind of diversity, but especially religious diversity, is that compassion can transcend our differences. Regardless of our cultural or religious differences, patients and their families absolutely know when they are being treated with compassion. Compassion is the foundation of cultural humility. Compassion is the language that everyone understands. And there is a difference between empathy and compassion. Compassion, of course, means identifying suffering and having the desire and wanting to do something to alleviate that suffering. Empathy is actually putting yourself in the shoes of someone else. It's almost feeling what they're feeling. This can be a little bit more complex when you're dealing with religious diversity, because a lot of times it's difficult for us to know what that family's going through, and they have all sorts of different beliefs about things. So empathy, in some sense, even though we all have general feelings about death and dying that we can relate to, empathy did not serve me well as a requester for a couple of reasons. One is that assuming what other people might feel that are very diverse, and then the other is, when you have to feel and you're dealing with so much death and dying, it can be very overwhelming. So, but however you determine, of course, is what's important to you. But I find out that compassion for us is very, very important, and hopefully that you can remember that. So as we kind of review our car analogy, the first thing that we want to do is, again, challenge those assumptions. Do a little investigation and research around implicit bias. It's really, really fascinating, especially when we're seeing a lot of that right now popping up in the news with our differences being exposed. So don't be afraid to challenge that. And the next thing, add knowledge. It was very fun for me to learn about all the different religions and have Brian come. But as this slide shows you a little bit, it is a balance, because once you add a lot of knowledge, some people then can start to rely on those stereotypes. Gosh, they learned that this group tends to do this, and so then they make that jump that everyone within that group will do it. So knowledge is very, very important for cultural humility, but only if you keep it balanced. And the next thing is very simply ask questions. Ask what you can do to support a family. We had a Hindu family that was really suffering, and asked what we could do to support them. And they wanted candles lit in the room, and they wanted the bed turned a certain way. And we could turn the bed. We certainly couldn't light candles, but what our folks did was get battery operated candles. And just that symbolic reaching out and helping that group through that was important, and it was very symbolic. And finally, the very most important thing that you can do is remember compassion. Many of you probably have on your websites that all major religions support organ and tissue donation. That's not entirely true. There's some truth in it, but we have found that it is better to say that all major religions support life and generosity and compassion. And as a result of that, some people from all different religions have chosen organ and tissue donation. Many of you are familiar with the honor walk that we do for organ donors. Usually it is the organ donor being escorted through the hospital staff to the OR. In this particular case, as an aftercare specialist, I facilitated this donor family and recipient meeting. The mom on the right had lost her 11-year-old son, and this was the lung recipient. And the two families came together, and the hospital decided it would be a sign of respect, since the little boy never got the honor walk, to have an honor walk for both of the families. It was a very compassionate act, and believe me, it went a long way. Again, we appreciate your attendance today. I wish you could, if at all possible, try and get more information from Brian, because he is a wealth. He can help you with populations of Buddhism and Sikhism and Hinduism. We just touched a little bit on Islam and Judaism today, but he's a great resource. And the more you can learn, the better you do. We're all in this together. So thank you so much.
Brian, I really appreciate you taking the time to join us and to share your insights here on this topic. I don't know why my camera's not coming on. I apologize. So we're now going to go ahead and open the floor up for questions. So just as a reminder for everyone, if you do have any questions, you can go ahead and submit them in our chat box. That's going to be located at the bottom of your screen. With that said, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Amanda. Thank you.
Hey, thank you, Susan and Brian, for the information. It was wonderful. We do have a few questions. Susan, can you tell us the role of the Interfaith Council at Gift of Hope?
Sure. Our Interfaith Council came together about 7 years ago. It was a result of our CEO attending a Donor Sabbath event with the Secretary of State. And the Secretary of State, who manages the registry in Illinois, had different faith leaders from all different religions beside him. And our CEO was very touched by that. He came back to Gift of Hope. I was a requester at the time, and I asked him if I could help with that. And he put me in charge of it. So be careful what you ask for. But anyway, it's been a great journey, and we put together these leaders. And we meet 2 or 3 times a year, but individually, they help us with consulting on cases, on terminology. Most recently, we talked about Donor Sabbath a lot, and they let us know that for an interfaith group, that Donor Sabbath wasn't as inclusive of language as they liked. So we actually changed our language to make it Faith and Hope Month, and we still have Donor Sabbath weekend within that month for those who find that language useful. But we expanded that. That was totally as a result of their recommendations. A lot of times they serve, if we have a donor tribute, they offer a prayer. Any of our events they show up at, and they're a great group. They have taught us a lot of things.
Susan and or Brian, how do you respond when a family is unaware of their religious beliefs about donation?
Well, and I'll let Brian comment on this afterwards. In my years approaching a family, that was not unusual. You would come to a family to have the donation conversation, and they were completely unaware of what their religion's stance was on it. And I think that's why this cultural humility conversation is really important, because as we mentioned, most religions are not hierarchical. Buddhism and Hinduism and Sikhism, they don't have a central leader. So there are many different schools of thought. So what I would tell a family is not to, or a requester, not to concentrate on trying to express or help someone get to what their theology is, but talk about compassion and ask them if their religion believes in love and generosity and giving and life, and start with those questions. What do you think, Brian?
Yeah, I think that sounds very good. I do think the humility piece is key. The religious literacy we're talking about can certainly help as well, just to know a little bit about the tradition, and in some cases to say, there does have to be this humility, right? You don't want to say, well, the answer is Bob, here's the answer. But sometimes knowing, emphasizing the compassion and saying, I was informed that, I know some Muslims have taken, there's some major bodies that have said that that have supported it because, it says this in the Quran, but, it's your call. And what do you think? And I think that kind of blend of sometimes knowing a little to be able to say there are some groups in your community that have said yes. I know people in your community that said yes, but emphasizing the compassion and leaving it up to them. I think that combination of knowing a little sometimes can provide some kind of comfort, but always framed within a humility. You don't want to tell them I have the answer. It's on my card back here.
Yeah, we kind of made that mistake early on when we got all excited about interfaith, and we learned a lot, and we had this information, and we'd go into families and we'd go, this is what you believe. That didn't go well. So yeah, it's better to be humble, have that information in your back pocket, especially like if a Hindu family or a Buddhist family talks about karma, you want to know what that means, and you can be supportive, but you don't have to be the one to push that on them.
Yeah.
And Brian, what sort of training do you offer to OPOs?
Oh, yeah, the training that I do, I refer to it as beyond diversity training. Diversity training in terms of religion can often, it's very good, to be clear, but there's often a focus on sort of do's and don'ts, and you can go through the do's and don'ts, the checklist fairly quickly. But I try to do more than that. I am trying to create comfort. Religion is a topic where there is a lot of discomfort, especially if it's a religion you're not familiar with. And it comes across, in a bunch of little micro expressions and pauses and stuff like this that can convey something to the other person. And so what I try and do is I actually try and teach people some of the basics of these traditions, so that obviously you're not going to come out an expert. You don't have to be, but just that you go, okay, I sort of have a sense of this. And layered into that, I always customize it for who I'm doing it with. So with OPOs, I always talk a fair bit about the dying process, and about sometimes there are rules about how they want the person's last moments to go, how they want the body, angled or directed or something like that, as well as all the issues around donation, around theological and practical and sometimes cultural objections and things like that. So usually I'm asked to come and speak on 4 or 5 traditions, Hindus and Muslims and Buddhists and Jews and Sikhs, I think, generally. And so that's what I've done for those OPOs. And if anyone else is interested, I don't know if I'll be coming via plane or whether it'll be via Zoom, but I'd love to be able to do that.
Well, thank you for answering the questions.
Yeah, thanks.
Deanna, we can turn it back to you.
Perfect. Thank you, Amanda. That looks like we're just about to conclude today's webinar. So on behalf of the Alliance, I'd just like to extend our sincerest thanks to both Brian and Susan for taking the time to join us today to enlighten us on what I think is such an important topic. I know I've personally had the chance to sit in on one of Brian's in-person workshops, and the amount of knowledge that he shared with us is so beneficial, I think, to the whole community of practice. And so I hope you all found some great takeaways from today's presentation. I certainly encourage you to check out some of the resources that Brian has provided, and check out his website and all of that. So thank you all so much for joining us. To our participants, as always, we thank you for taking the time to join us today, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.